Good afternoon and welcome to What Comes Next Live. As always, our show will be half an hour of conversation around you guessed it, theme of what comes next. I always love listening to inspiring guests, and today's guest is my friend and fellow mentor, Alan Dean, coming to us live and direct from the northwest of England, where I have no idea if he's allowed out of his house or not at the moment under the current variable restrictions. Last week, we had my hugely energetic friend Ian Armiger on the show, the coach's coach and elite swimming coach. Alan comes from the business world and brings a very different and zen energy in general, although who knows what he'll bring today. Over to you, Alan.
Okay, well then, good afternoon. I've been in the place of work for 50 years. So looking at me, you'd never guess, would you?
Not at all.
So the first 30 years were in a variety of roles. So it's very difficult to categorize me. But needless to say, I've been there in various roles enough to be, what I have been for the last 20 years, is a mentor of business leaders. The last 10 of which has been with Merrick, and you can look that up later, but they are wonderful friends and people to work with. So the first thing to say about what comes next is who knows? And what's on my mind right now is something that I've reflected on for this initial chat, which is the subject of trust. And it's a really important thing in leadership, but it is increasingly, in my view, showing up against the world stage. World leaders are very short of trust by the public as a generalization. And if we look at what comes next, I think we need to restore a much greater level of trust. And the business world has not really recovered its trust mojo since the financial collapse 10 years ago.
Agreed.
And some institutions have gone from most trusted to least trusted. So I would start by saying what's on my mind right now is that if we get that better understood, then we will have a better world. Now, if we drill that down to leadership, when I do work with teams, I'm very fond of a book by Patrick Lencioni, and his basic theme is that amongst the other things that a team should have, trust. Without trust, you can't really have an effective team. And I don't think we have enough time to explore what that might mean. But the other thing I would like to say is that we're suffering from, I think, a shortage in quality thinking. So the two things that are going on in my mind right now for what comes next: trust, which we can explore if you choose, and the quality of thinking, which is really important and particularly important right now. So leaders, because there have been so many challenges going on in terms of what come next, need to be, and if they're not, I don't think they will succeed. They need to be highly adaptive and resilient. So how do they combine being highly adaptive and resilient and yet maintain trust? And I think that's quite a challenge. So one of the things they perhaps need to do now is to find time to think, as distinct from simply responding to all the stuff that's going on at the moment. And the danger is to be super responsive and not thoughtful. So I know this perhaps doesn't sound particularly original, but leaders need to find the right questions and to find time to think about the right questions for what comes next. So I think if they don't find time to think, they are not going to find time to ask the right questions. They don't have to come up with the right answers. So I see that politicians at the moment think that they are obliged to come up with the right answers and don't stop to think. Quite a lot of the, shall we just say politely, things that are not going well are as a result of things not being thought through very well. The result of that is that things go wrong and trust goes down. So outside the corporate environment, in the political environment, the problems that many governments have had, and I'm not going to make a political case about our own government, is that people started off with a fairly high level of trust as to what to do as this CV-19 thing came along the way. And you can see that the problem that everybody is facing now is the erosion of trust.
Yes.
And so I think we come back to what comes next means leaders who not only inspire a degree of trust as distinct from not thinking and coming out with stuff and then losing it. I think one other thing that might be useful in our discussion is obviously the leader is not alone and has to have a team. And I think that I want to just put out there 3 qualities of team which are vital, they're not exclusive for what comes next. And that is the team needs to have a mindset of helpfulness to one another. Mm-hmm. It's the opposite of silos. They need much more social cohesion, and that is a real challenge when it's virtual.
Yep.
So social cohesion is rubbing along with one another at a time when we can't. What do we do? So we have to think of different ways of doing that. And then the other thing, which I think is lacking, is diversity of thinking. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff out there about diversity, but I think if I look across the pond, what I can see is a lot of yes men. And I think that I don't mean in business, I mean in politics. And I think there's a danger of that in our world here. Mm-hmm. And I think what comes next should really be people who are not afraid to stand up and be counted as not having the same view as their leader. So that's a fair sort of little basket of stuff on my mind.
Well, first of all, thank you for putting your mind to this, because you've come in with a few specific thoughts put together very clearly, as always in my experience of talking to you. So trust, teams, quality thinking, and being highly adaptive and resilient, and then some qualities of teams. And yes, Patrick Lencioni is very much worthwhile for people to look up as an author. I'm frankly too lazy to do podcast notes, so people have to look it up for themselves. My context for the show is easy. I'm a little bit selfish. I love it. The guests can just rock up and we can talk for half an hour. I'm really interested in the idea of quality thinking. And let me just inject something to spin this with you a little bit. I started writing over 1,000 daily blogs ago, and part of this was around a concept I had. I did a survey, not scientific, but I knew 25 CEOs around the world. Well, I knew more than 25, but I phoned up 25 CEOs and asked them a series of questions based upon some things I was observing. I asked each of them, does your company have a strategic plan? To which the answer was, in every case, yes. How many years does it run over? And the answer was always one of 2, either 3 or 5 years. I then asked them, how many months, weeks or months, did it typically take team or teams of people to put this together? And the answer was roughly 3 to 6 months, and many, many man hours, often hundreds or thousands. Then I asked them the key question. I use exactly the same wording in every case. How long from when your strategic plan is put into play is it no longer worth the paper it is written on? Not does it work well, but no longer worth the paper it's written on. And being vaguely statistically accurate, both the mean and the median answer was 6 months. Fundamentally, an awful lot of time is wasted doing strategic planning. And one of the things that came to my mind was the idea that we live in a literally unthinkable world where we cannot come up with the answers. Hence my position that the age of, except in crises, the age of command and control leadership is over. And so you've got a beautiful way of putting this, and you've always, in my experience of talking to you, come up with great questions. And it is this element of valuing thinking, taking time for thinking, and the role of a senior executive or leader is about finding the right questions that need to be answered, not coming up with the answers themselves. So we sit with leading politicians all over the world feeling they have to come up with answers. And I'm just going to make a not really political statement, but around quality thinking. I was sitting listening to the Chancellor of the UK government, the Treasury Secretary in American language, who is a quality thinker. I may not agree with his thinking, but he is a quality thinker. And I'm listening to him going, I don't know if he's asking the right questions. I don't fundamentally believe he handled it quite as well as he could have done, but basically put a pretty good crack at handling financially COVID. But I'm looking around at his peers in the cabinet thinking, there is an absolute paucity of quality thinkers. And if I went back to my childhood, and you have a few years on me, I've only been in the workforce 35 years, not 50. But back in those days, while I may have fundamentally disagreed with the politics of quite a number of the leading politicians, there was an abundance of quality thinking in place at that time. And maybe the world wasn't moving so fast. We can absolutely talk about trust, but I'm particularly interested in hearing a bit more reflection from you on what is quality thinking, and perhaps some insights for leaders who may listen to this podcast later, as to what are a couple of really good questions one can ask of oneself or our team.
Oh dear. Well, look, let me go slightly tangentially and talk about the neuroscience of thinking.
Okay.
Because there's been quite a lot of work done about that in the last few years. And I'm much more likely to get a result from somebody. I'm not talking necessarily as a leader. I'm talking as a mentor. Mm-hmm. If I ask them some questions around their thinking. So let me give you a very easy example. Or sorry, let me give you an example that I hope will resonate with the audience. Somebody comes to me and says, boss, I have a problem. Mm-hmm. And I would envisage that most people would say, help me understand what that problem is. Not offer a solution, but help me understand what that problem is. And neurologically, the moment you do that, you become engaged in the problem. So the leader's job is to get the thinking from the person who's talking to them, mm-hmm. in terms of asking a great question. And the questions are not necessarily very difficult. Look, before you tell me about anything here, how long has this been on your mind? On a scale of 10, how important is it for you to get a solution to it.
Yeah.
If it's been on their mind for 24 hours and it's only a 5, let's not have the conversation.
Excellent.
So you get a lot of information without knowing what the subject of the issue happens to be. And I'm envisaging that what's going on is that, that individual probably knows the answer to his question or her question, but you're asking me for a general thing about a quality of thinking is to get the thinking of others, to be curious about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as I've said, the moment you become engaged in the stuff, you lose the quality to have insights. And so if you could imagine that your head has a sort of a sea of tranquility along the middle, but the moment you start getting involved in what is the thing that we're talking about, it starts to produce waves.
Right.
And in the context of those waves, you can't get any insights. That's why I would never use the expression brainstorming.
Excellent.
You actually do not want your brain to storm.
You want it to be calm. You listed out a number of fantastic questions. What really struck me in that was when you were talking about trust, what comes next is we need more trust. We need to trust our leaders. Then you talked about the team that work with the leader, helpfulness, social cohesion, and diversity of thinking. And you said about the diversity of thought, being not afraid to stand up and be counted. So this is one of those thoughts that, as a coach, I love it when people say, that seems so obvious now. The operative word being now. When you say something really simple, it's one definition of wisdom, and I love playing with definitions of wisdom. One is something concise that when you hear it, you feel you always knew it.
No.
And I've been coaching for years. And there's something about the way you expressed that and the energy with which you expressed the questions, which made me realize that a leader who asks questions about the thinking of the other person without getting into the content whatsoever empowers them. That person feels trusted, and that person feels they can stand up and be counted and say what's on their mind. They've not even got into the content, but they're all of a sudden feeling, oh, they value my opinion and they haven't even heard it yet.
But the other thing is that I've framed this in the context of somebody bringing a problem.
Yes.
But let's think of the leader talking to his people, and there's a large level of trust there. But what's necessary is the one-to-one time they spend with their direct reports.
Yeah.
The leader has a point there of saying, so can we have an agenda for this conversation? What are the top 3 things that you'd like to discuss, or that kind of stuff? Mm-hmm. Which is actually quite assertive. Whereas if you express the same thing with the person and say, so since we last met, what have you found yourself thinking?
Yeah.
The person may very well go silent on you, but you will have a more enriching conversation.
Agreed.
What next?
Well, let me flip it on you. From what we've been talking about, what do you want to talk about next?
Well, I'm still struck by, well, let's think about a little bit more about leadership, because I think this is at the heart of some of the stuff that you're talking about and the people watching this is around. So I talked about adaptive and resilient. So there's one step before that when there's something horrible happening. and that is to care for one's people.
Right.
I think it's worth just thinking about a little bit more about, well, what does adaptive and resilient mean? I think adaptive ties in very well with your story about strategic planning.
Yes.
I think at the moment, strategic planning is completely useless. I think what you need to do is scenario envisaging.
Yes.
You need to say, we don't know what's going to happen, you know. It's always been the case that we can't tell what the future holds. And so if you take that to its obvious conclusion, you'd never do a strategic plan. What you do is you think about, with the best will of the team, what scenarios might be coming down the road, what comes next.
Mm-hmm.
And be adaptive and resilient in being able to address those scenarios as and when they come. Now, I would argue that if you look at the businesses that have not succeeded during COVID, they were neither adaptive nor resilient. So without running the risk of somebody saying, hey, what are you talking about? I would say a lot of the fast food chains were neither adaptive nor resilient. They were going pear-shaped before COVID. All that COVID does is amplify the pear, if that doesn't sound daft.
That's very British, but I love the pear-shaped and amplify the pear. Excellent.
Very, very recently, we've had cinema chains going asleep effectively. Mm-hmm. Now, these cinemas had really equipped themselves to be resilient in the face of social distancing and all of that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they'd done any thinking about the fact that the same things that were affecting the world were affecting the manufacture of films. So why is it a great surprise in the scenarios that we haven't got any films to show? A few months ago, they were showing golden oldies. Well, how long can you show golden oldies as a strategy? So what was adaptive about that? What else could they have done? I've not got the answer, but they ought to have had some scenarios apart from just closing.
One of my friends was one of the world's only tourism futurists about 15 years ago, and I loved reading his scenarios. He said I was the only person who ever read them. Some of them were wild, but you could be running classrooms in cinemas, for example. Going back to something you said a couple of minutes ago. You talked about, and I'll link it to something, a language piece. You were saying that political leaders, one of the things they could benefit from and haven't really shown very often through this crisis have been finding time to think as opposed to simply responding. We can disagree on definitions, but responding to me involves taking, very Viktor Frankl, man's search for meaning-esque, involves taking time to respond to external stimuli. It actually means taking time. To me, being reactive is what we've been doing, which is operating from a space of having to have the answers, somewhat fear-based, and not actually pausing. And linking to that, I'm going to put two thoughts into this. One is caring for one's people was the first thing to do, right? And the level of strategic, when we cannot have granular answers, where we get into we move out of the sea of tranquility of the mind and into brainstorming, fantastic language, Alan, is that if we try to predict the future at too granular and content-based a level, if we run a strategic plan at the very highest level of a company, it'll be around its purpose or its values. And a very large company that I worked with one of the very senior leaders on directly after COVID hit, we talked regularly, and the conversation was, how do we care for our people? And this company has 4 core values, and every key decision in that company is permeated or run through the lens of the values. And at that time, it was not about how do we hit next month's results. It was how do we care for our people, with tens of thousands of people around the world. And with that lens, you then link to that and say, how is your team behaving? do you trust the people to work together? If one of their values is around the word together, and I won't be too specific to name the company, then that becomes a piece, well, are we actually working together? Are we caring for each other? What does that mean? Are we putting our people at the forefront? So as a sort of specific guidance around what you're referring to is at a higher, my own thought is at a higher level than the base content, then you can have quality thinking and you can apply it and be more adaptive and resilient. So it's almost like trust becomes the outcome of quality thinking and planning at a slightly more contextual level.
So I think, just to build on what you've just said, I think companies need to revisit, is their purpose fit for purpose?
Indeed, indeed.
It might have been a purpose for the great times, not for the difficult times. But it ought to be a purpose that will serve them still. And it just needs a bit of a sense check. Is this purpose still serving us? So if it is, and if one's paying attention to the values that you have just referred to, you're well on the way to being able to have some scenarios. Because in the context of the team discussion, if a scenario doesn't fit your purpose or doesn't fit your values, you discount it.
And that's perfect. And using the example of the cinemas we're talking about in the UK, which are, for those not in the UK, the two biggest chains just announced they're going to close temporarily because there's no movies coming out. The client company I was referring to, they have a purpose statement that has nothing to do with the industry they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they could actually completely pivot their people over time, which would be a radical scenario. They could go with a more evolutionary scenario. But if they had a purpose and commercial vision linked to the purpose that was too narrow, they could be totally stuck, such as a cinema chain that shows Hollywood movies. Mm-hmm. Now, that cinema chain could get into the business of being a socially distanced lecture hall for a nearby college.
Or a place where trials can be held. Because
brilliant.
You know.
Yeah. So
I mean, they don't have to close. The extraordinary thing is that the limiting value that we show blockbuster movies leads them to close.
Yeah, and they have well-located, well geared up for social distancing venues that normally have multiple theaters of different sizes where lectures could be held and events could be held.
Criminal trials could be held.
Criminal trials could be held, exactly.
And if you are going to do any of those things, you might still keep alive those fast food things that typically clutch around the cinemas. I've
just got a vision of a QC with a massive, great container of popcorn.
Yeah, but any cinema complex which is closed has got, a Ben and Jerry's or a Wagamuna or whatever they are.
All around them, yes. Yeah.
All around them. And so those industries or those businesses probably can't sustain themselves because no one's coming to the cinema. I mean, it's just it's a really good example of how the purpose statement is so narrow that it doesn't admit to any adaptability or any resilience, whatever.
Fantastic. Now, these weekly conversations, the What Comes Next Live that I have, we run them for half an hour. And one of the things I've observed is with people I already know, they tend to be a fantastic example of a fly in the wall. And Alan, you and I tend to talk every few weeks for about an hour and a half, and we often overrun. And because we're friends, we get into content as well. And sometimes the sea of tranquility gets disturbed because we can do that over a cup of tea. And this is because it's run as a recorded live podcast, it's felt quite disciplined, or even more so than our usual friend conversations and co-mentoring conversations. And so I want to thank you. I have found this really stimulating with a lot of learnings. And I've got written down that I'm going to reach out to a leading neuroscientist called Dr. Tara Swart, who I last spoke to a couple of years ago and has since become a best-selling author. So the neuroscience of thinking is, I'll be looking to get her on my show to bring some thinking diversity of thought from a different direction. So thank you for that. I would do something a little bit different now and leave you to make a couple of closing thoughts before we say goodbye to our live and podcast audience.
Okay. So in saying goodbye, do find time to think and craft your questions with care.
Thank you, Alan. Absolutely perfect. It has been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.